It is, yeah, a great honour to be able to introduce Johanna Sumiala, and her talk will be looking at ritualising grief online. What would Victor Turner say? And I'm very interested to think, what would he say? So Johanna is a professor at Media and Communication Studies at the University of Helsinki in Finland. She is author of the fantastic book Mediated Death, and is currently leading a really, really interesting, compelling EU-funded project looking at digital death. So Johanna will speak for 30 minutes, and then we'll open for Q&A for 10 minutes at the end. So once again, to the audience, please put your questions in the Q&A so that we can address them after Johanna's presented. But thank you, Johanna.
Thank you so much for this very kind invitation to take part in this symposium. I've listened to all of your presentations, and I think that I have learned a lot. Let me start by sharing my slides here. So what I'm going to present today, it's a kind of an intellectual thought experiment and a theoretical reflection. I don't wish to provide any final answers, but rather to hopefully to encourage discussion and conversation on something that I've been thinking about for some time now. I should also I would also like to start by saying that that I will be focusing to a certain extent on structures. In humanities and social sciences, as we all know, there's this kind of an interesting dynamic between agency and structures, and one should say that there is no one without another. But perhaps here my focus is more on the questions related to structures. I'm also I've studied death from different perspectives, perhaps some 20 years now, and I should say that a lot of this research has been focusing on rituals. Hence, I will be looking at questions related to grief and mourning, by the way, which I use here synonymously, even though I understand that there is a kind of there's also scholarly debate whether grief is more something that is related to individual emotions and emotional performing emotions, and mourning is something more public and more collective in a way, but here I wish to use them synonymously. And then I would also like to also like to focus on the question of death. So it's really about the death and rituals and mourning that this presentation is about. So let me start with an anthropologist, Barbara Meyerhoff, and this is a kind of a citation from her work in the 1984, where she discusses rituals as, or she talks about the highly repetitive nature of life crisis rituals. So she considers death rituals as life crisis rituals. And why in a condition or in a phase when something unexpected happens, there's a loss of life, why do we need these rituals or ritualized practices? That is, according to her, because they provide a message and a pattern they provide us a message and a pattern of predictability. So when everything is chaotic, where there's a loss of life, and we need this sense of life, the sense of being confirmed that life will go on, and so we need structure. And then she says that the more unpredictable one's condition, the more fundamental one's need to feel secure. And ritualized practices are something that they may, if they succeed, if they don't, they may not, to provide this kind of a sense of continuity. When it comes to social media, and here I would like to, since the task that I was given was perhaps not so much to talk about, particularly on rituals on TikTok, but in social media in broader terms. They invite individuals and communities, so both individuals and communities and networks, as we have seen in your wonderful presentations here, to engage with familiar symbols and means of symbolic communication. So in my work, I've been interested in what kind of symbols we share when we start to post something online, social media, whether it's TikTok or Instagram or Facebook or X today, and how the social media encourages people to spread messages that they may not under normal conditions conceive or even believe. So there's this interesting aspect to the symbolic communication that is that can be related to these ritual practices. And obviously it is a kind of an empirical question of how they appear there. And so at the heart of these ritual practices is to bring a sense of familiarity and a sense of continuation and sense of continuity in this sense of chaos. So ritualized practices, in my understanding, and here I'm drawing on the work of Barbara Meyerhoff, are very much about bringing structure to social life. And so how do these ritualized practices, how do they may look like when we go to social media? Here I offer you some examples here. These are the examples. We've conducted empirical research on the Christchurch attacks in New Zealand. And on my left, you can see a crying kiwi. So this is a very typical kind of a memified visual presentation of a ritualized practice where there's a use of a symbol, kiwi, a national symbol in New Zealand, and crying. And that's something that is kind of easy to understand. Why is it important? It's easy to understand because it helps to promote and enhance circulation. The other one, hello brother. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but this was so the perpetrator, he used GoPro camera when he committed his crimes and these massacres in these two mosques. And the first person that he met was a man who warmly greeted the perpetrator because he was thinking that he would come to pray with them. And he said, hello, brother. And since the perpetrator was using this camera, this was recorded and it was actually online streamed on Facebook. So this hello, brother began to circulate, and it became one of the symbols that actually brought people together in their mourning and in their grief, and as a demonstration of solidarity. So to me, these two examples illustrate in one of the ways in which this ritualization takes place and how it brings order to the sense of chaos. Here you can I've applied Sabine Barden's definition of what might a mourning mean in social media. So it's a use of social media to mourn in a public way. So this is a kind of a simple way of defining social media mourning and how and then think how that relates to rituals. So here I'm drawing on my on my previous book that was published 2021 and 2022 2 on mediated death, where I'm trying to identify certain general characteristics on social media mourning and how they relate to the ritual practices here. So one kind of important way for us to understand when we think about the rituals in social media, whether it's TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, or whatnot, is that rituals are always about doing. It's about action. It's about posting something. It's about sharing. It's about clicking. It's about sharing images, messages, hashtags. So this is when I start to work and try to identify the ritual practices in social media in relation to death. I'm interested in looking at what people do. What do they post? What is being shared? What is not being shared? Which obviously a kind of a difficult question to try to answer, but certainly an interesting and important thing to think about. I'm also interested in thinking about, as already mentioned, those patterned ways of repetitive symbolic communication. So there is an element of repetition, and many of you who have worked on grief and TikTok, I'm very confident that you have also identified these elements. There's someone already mentioned about, for example, pray for Paris, pray for Brussels. There's certain slogans that start to circulate, certain images often taken from the popular culture that are easily understandable, for example, for global audiences or at least international audiences. For example, if there's a public death event, then certain symbols, a kiwi, this bird, or talking about Paris attacks, there's a Tour of Eiffel, or different types of symbols after the Manchester attacks in Manchester. There was a concert by what's her name? Grande, and there was a terror attack there. People started to circulate images of Manchester bee, because bee is one of the symbolic kind of animals, and it's a working class town, city, and bees are considered to be very hardworking. So people started to circulate these images in order to share their solidarity for the victims. And here I wanted to also emphasize that in my work, I've been interested, particularly, as you may have already noticed, have been interested in the public death. So, and it would be an interesting conversation to have whether how to in today's digitalized sphere that we share, the distinction between private and public. But here I'm mainly referring to people mourning, expressing a sense of grief and mourning, emotional attachment to someone or to those victims whom they only know through and via media. So in that sense, and my question is, what kind of difference, and can we identify differences when we are thinking about when people are mourning over people that who they have lost and who they know who they have intimate or had intimate relationships. And I think we have today we have seen many examples of that, and this would be something that I would like to discuss further with you, the sense of public and private, and what kind of relationships people have in relation to these victims or people who have passed away. As a kind of perhaps some of these are rather kind of general characteristics, but I think when we are trying to think about the commonalities, in order to think about the kind of large and broader kind of structural level here, it is important to acknowledge that how we must understand that there are various actors who mourn and produce ritual activities, and so it can be so-called ordinary users, social media users, but also obviously the news media actors, journalists, different types of PR organizations, especially when it comes to these large-scale public death events. And there are all kinds of activities taking place, and from all kinds of motivations. Whereas in some cases it is about mourning, it's about solidarity. In other cases it's about hijacking. Someone mentioned about hijacking and how these slogans that were first used to create solidarity and sense of compassion may be used also against of these victims and also of their mourners, and how it all takes place simultaneously, and hence it actually makes it quite hard when we are trying to think about the broader context here. Then apparently, obviously, goes without saying that this is very much about sharing emotions. So it's very much about, and it can be about different types of emotions. I think some of the presentations here made beautiful reference to how mourning can be used also to engage social activity and kind of a political activity, and yeah. And it is very much about creating and maintaining that in the literature is called parasocial relationships. And now I'm referring to mourning that is related to the disease and victims who these people do not have a personal relationship. And then we need to empirically also research more about the nature of these parasocial relationships as imaginary relationships, which are in many ways no less real than the relationships that we have with people who we physically know. But in the literature, they often do make this distinction. And then obviously goes without saying, it takes place at multiple digital platforms. This I've already mentioned. And here I wanted to make special reference to the grief talk, which has also been mentioned here. And it's made out of different types of mixed remediations. So there's a rich, as many of us know, there's a kind of a rich culture of intertextual references and people using popular culture references, for example, to post these messages and to engage in these ritualized actions, and it results local circulations. And now I'm again referring to mourning of kind of public death. And the concept of local typically means that there's an element of global and an element of local, and it's interesting to see how they come together, and also what kind of interpretive communities we are addressing here, and how do these messages and how do these ritualized actions, how do they travel and practices from different types of cultural context, and the commonalities and related to that, and also differences. So here I provide you with one kind of very typical, if you will, a typical example of a practice of ritualization around a slogan, "I can't breathe." This was, as many of you may be familiar with, started to circulate vividly after the death of George Floyd in the US, where he was killed by the policeman, and how these were the one of his last words when he said that I can't breathe. And then there was a person, and this is related to kind of thinking when we think about how these ritualized practices, how they where they can start from was that there was a person who actually filmed or recorded that, and how that started to circulate, and how it went viral, and the different forms of repeating and circulating this slogan, and attached to different types of visual images of demonstration, and a sense of demonstrating solidarity, and claiming for political injustices. So this would be one of the examples that we can use to when we think about the ritualized actions here. And then there are many others. So now I want to introduce to you three, and I'm sure there are others, but I want to introduce to you three different models or attempts to trying to conceptualize these developments in a kind of a broader level, trying to think about the commonalities and practices that motivate this social media mourning. So I'm going to discuss about social media mourning by Moore and their colleagues. And then I'm going to discuss about some developments around this concept of network grief. And then I will move on to discussing hyper mourning. So to me, these are, if in the beginning of this presentation, I tried to kind of provide a kind of large picture and wide picture of some of the elements here related to how can we study, how can we conceptualize and think about in theoretical and also in empirical sense what takes place when we are thinking about ritualization of death as social media mourning. Here I want to go deeper into the into some of the kind of more recent developments in trying to theorize that. So one and then I want to emphasize that I'm sure that there are many others, but these are the three that I found very useful also for my current research. So one way to think about social media mourning is to think about that, and this is now I'm relying on the work of Moore and their colleagues, and this was published in the journal called Omega. And they create this typology of one-way, two-way, and immortality communication, where they analyze the social media mourning, and I look at this from the perspective of kind of a ritual activity. The one way of looking at, I was starting to look at, is to look at this kind of one-way communication, which involves kind of the dissemination and sharing of information. When something happens, we read about it in digital media, whether newspaper, news media or social media or both. And we start to take action, and it's about sharing information. And I call this phase a kind of pre-ritual mourning, which usually precedes the ritual activity. So people start to say, what is going on? What is happening? There's a public death event has taken place. The second element has to do, or second phase has to do with a two-way communication, which consists elements of sharing emotions. And this is when people posting, they start to there's a kind of collective dimension, and they start to maintain and establish certain relationships with each other, certain perhaps parasocial relationships, not only with the deceased and the victims, but also with other people who are participating on this, and they are creating this kind of ephemeral social media mourning community, ephemeral in a sense that and that this might not last very long, but it is brought to life in that very moment. And the third element in that in that has to do with immortality communication, that has a kind of an element of commemoration and related to this continued connection and bonds, creating and maintaining continued bonds with the deceased. And someone already mentioned in some of the presentations, we already discussed about this continued bonds here. So in more and in their model, there's a kind of a temporal element related to these practices, a kind of preface, sharing emotions, and then commemoration. What is interesting when it comes to social media, and I wish to say something more in later phase of the presentation, is that actually this process is far from being linear, especially when we think about the two-way communication and immortality communication, that there's a certain kind of cyclicality and ongoingness there. And I think that this is one of the key challenges, that when it comes to theorizing ritualized practices and ritualization in social media in relation to earlier theorizing, Victor Turner, which I will turn to you in a minute, is that this is one of the, I think, key challenges here that we have to address, and we have to think more carefully. So then moving to network grief and Jeff Brubaker's work on this, on trying to conceptualize the process of social media grieving and looking at as networked, and then kind of my reading to that as a kind of ritualized it's a ritualized process. And here in this 6-phase model, they wish to explain the process of how people navigate and assess their responses when they are encountering public death. And here they provide, they discuss about acknowledging, which in a way relates to the more and their colleagues in kind of a first level, that you acknowledge that the public death event, and then you start to situate, you start to evaluate, you start to appropriate, and then you may take action. So I think their research is very valuable in a sense that they provide new knowledge about how people actually act, they situate and how they evaluate that. And I think this is related to what we were already discussing about the grievability and Butler's work, whether this public death event that we experience in this digital realm is actually worth public mourning or recognition, and obviously these are politically motivated questions, and it's interesting and important to study that, especially in relation to this question, how people negotiate that. This is also related to a question how people negotiate their kind of also their personal relationship. So perhaps this is some influencer has passed away, someone has, they are old classmates, and person may consider that whether he or she should be publicly posting on something, or sharing a TikTok video, for example, on this person, and they are negotiating their relationship with that. And it's a kind of it's a very kind of a socially invested experience, and important for us to acknowledge when we are thinking about trying to understand social media ritual mourning. And lastly, I'm referring here to Corinna Giaxoglos. I'm not sure if I pronounced her last name proper, but her work on mourning, and where she provides a typology actually of 5 types of mourning, and here I'm going to focus on 3. three aspects, and the one has to do with connective, a second cosmopolitan, and the third rebellious hypermourning. And in that, in her analysis, connective type of hypermourning typically involves immediate ritual responses. So what people start when they take action, and when there's a hashtag, for example, the one very famous example is the hashtag Je suis Charlie. After the Charlie Hebdo attacks in Paris, there was an we can identify there was a journalist who Jean Rongin, who actually created that hashtag, and then he put it on circulation, and how soon it began to circulate vividly. It's still called Twitter, and in different other digital spaces. So this would be one of the very immediate ritual responses to this to news of death. The cosmopolitan resonates, the cosmopolitan hypermourning resonates with Moore's and their model typology, I think, of two-way and this immortalized communication. But it's very much about sharing images and sharing personal memories and visits to the sites associated with life of the deceased. When it comes to personal memories, I think this is important. It's important to acknowledge, for example, when you think about mourning in relation to and in context of fan cultures, how people in the aftermath of, for example, of the death of David Bowie and many other figures, public figures, celebrities and pop icons, how people start to share personal memories when they went to a concert, when they, and share those memories online, and hence create a sense of togetherness in those times. And then finally, she introduces this concept of rebellious hypermourning. That is a mourning that creates a momentum, and there's a kind of a movement to ritually communicate kind of political kind of wrongs and try to make a change and difference. In my empirical work, I, for example, studied the death of this Iranian female, Amini, and who was killed by in Tehran by the Iranian police, and how different types of public demonstrations around, for example, ritual hair cutting. So women in different parts of the world started to cut their hair as a kind of a ritual sign of demonstrating, a symbolic sign of demonstrating solidarity for her death, and also demonstrating against the police brutality. So she was not wearing a veil and or in a proper way, and hence she was taken into custody and later killed when she was in police custody. So this would be an example of rebellious hypermourning. So while I find these three models, typologies, they're analytically highly useful in trying to go deeper into and analyzing how these ritualized practices take place, one must take into consideration that there's a strong focus on social media mourning as a ritual activity, as a kind of a ritual in its own right. So they are focusing here very much on a process and a kind of on a temporality, on a certain kind of practices, and on the mourners. And by the way, here I wanted to share a blog. This is the title of the blog by one of the presenters here who gave a presentation here and and provided a wonderful blog in our project on this very topic of navigating the grief journey, how TikTok users share their grief. And I think that this also resonates nicely with what I have been saying here. So I just wanted to endorse that in this context. But the focus here is very much on process, practices, and mourners. And here, I would like to turn to Victor Turner. So the presentation was titled, "What would Victor Turner say?" And here is the title, here's the book cover of his book on the ritual process. And for those of you, it seems that we have a group of anthropologists here and people trained in anthropology. So Victor Turner might not be a stranger for you, but those of you who might not be that familiar with his work, I just want to briefly mention his work has been very seminal on developing this theory of death rituals, where he thinks about death rituals, and he's obviously has been developing that based on on Van Gennep's work and many others. But what Victor Turner, what he says about death rituals is that he thinks about them as life crisis rituals, as did Meyerhoff, but also as and rites of passage, where there's a kind of linear process. There's a rupture, something happens, and this actually fits very well when it comes to studying public death, that something happens, there's a public death event, and there's a loss of life that takes place suddenly. There's an element of liminality in which the old order is broken and the new order has not been created. The sense of continuity has not been created, and there's a sense of liminality there, and which means that and this is exactly the phase where people gather together. They start to post things in social media. When we think about that, this classical theory of Victor Turner in relation to social media, one of the key challenges here is the cyclicality and this question of ongoing rupture and liminality. Because social media, there is no, the dead are always, and whatever we post, they're always kind of a one click away from us. You know, as someone was saying, that they are here. And then so the question of the new order, the question of the restructuring new order, this is one of the main challenges here. And while many of these new models and these three models that I wanted to present here, they are well adapted to affordances and they are elements. They are elements of vernacularization of ritual practices, commodification of emotions and attention economy. My question to you and to us is that what kind of a social contract these ritual practices actually provide with the living and the dead, and how in a broader societal level, how they help, and do they still help us to kind of cope with the dead, or are we in a more macro level, are we left with this endless emotional competition over visibility and attention in our emotionalized, ritualized practices? So then the question is that if the Turnerian theory is in many ways problematic, where can we find new ways to think about the kind of a broader context of thinking about the relationship between death, mourning, and ritual in society? And now I see Larissa, and I think that I might be a bit over time here. So I want to leave it here, and I look very much forward to your questions and comments. And as my final reflection, this is still very much about kind of an intellectual thought experiment, but I think that we need to bring these broader theories into into a kind of a conversation with our empirical work that we do within these platforms, TikTok and others. So thank you so much for your attention.
We've got like 5 minutes left, and I just wanted to, there are quite a few people that need to be thanked. I mean, firstly, to our keynote speakers, Johanna and Moa, thank you so much. Such insightful, powerful work. Also to all our presenters, because it's been an amazing, and everyone has taken us on such a beautiful journey, and really thinking about all those kind of textures and gestures. And I can see Crystal's got her camera on, so I'm like, am I handballing to you at all, Crystal? But I would like to also thank Naomi, Naomi, you're going to put your camera on, who's been working very hard in the background there, doing a lot of the work to make this all so seamless. So thank you. And to Kirsten as well. And both are from the TikTok Cultures Research Network, and they have done so much amazing stuff with the logistics of the symposium. It's the fact that it looks so seamless, that is a testament to all their labor and skills. So thank you. I'd also like to thank my colleague, Kate Gerber. She's going to put on the camera. She's right next to me, because she's been very much in the background doing a lot of work. So thank you very much for that. And thank you to our attendees who have all who've asked really wonderful questions, and thank you for your deep listening, because this is a topic that is really, really important, and you have helped create that space that really is about respecting others. I would just like to say thank you very much to everyone, and this has been such a wonderful event, and that's because of you. So thank you, and yes, have a good morning, night, wherever you are. Thank you.